So can you be a Buddhist of another religion, or a secular Buddhist? We'll be discussing that question coming up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm really glad to have you here. If you're interested in helping to try to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, both for yourself and for everyone else, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll have talks about early Buddhism, secular Buddhism, and related kinds of ideas once or twice a week, Mondays and most Thursdays. So can you be a Christian Buddhist? Can you be a Jewish Buddhist? Can you be a Buddhist from another religion? Can you be a secular Buddhist? These are interesting questions, and I imagine many of us may have heard of close ties between, let's say, Zen practitioners and practitioners of Catholic versions of monasticism. And here I can just go on my own personal experience, which is I've shared many meditation sessions with relatively traditional Jewish people, relatively traditional Christian people, including on at least a couple of occasions, spending many hours with people who are Christian pastors or ministers. That is to say, if you go to certain Buddhist centers, you already will find people from other religious traditions attending and practicing side by side with people from more traditional Buddhist traditions. Now, of course, are these people then traditional Buddhists? No, they aren't. They have different kinds of philosophies, different kinds of belief systems, at least I would assume on the average. But the question is, to what extent are they, in a sense, secular Buddhists? Within a secular Buddhist tradition, what we're trying to do is to bracket the more speculative aspects of Buddhist belief, in particular the belief in rebirth, the belief in active karma that brings you into that next life, the idea that certain kinds of meditative accomplishments can lead to supernatural kinds of abilities. And by bracketing these things, we're allowing more room, I think, for experimentation with people of other traditions. We're opening up a space of practice that people with other kinds of beliefs can then inhabit alongside us. That is, instead of looking towards, let's say, the next life, which is a matter of some controversy between different religions, we're focusing instead on this life, how we can practice in the most skillful manner by being as wise as we can be, by being as kind as we can be, by lessening our stress levels with our both internally and in our conversations and interactions with other people. These are practices that can be useful no matter your religious tradition. That is to say, the Christian pastor may believe that by being kind to one another, one is making oneself a place in heaven, in an everlasting heaven. The traditional Buddhist may believe that by being kind to one another, one is opening oneself a place in a temporary heaven, or at least a better rebirth. And these are potential objects of conflict insofar as they become overt parts of the Dharma that we discuss and go over and have to subscribe to in the setting of our practice. But the extent to which we can bracket them, leave them to one side, and discuss simply the aspect of being kind to one another, that opens up this space for us to share fruitful practice with one another. Now, there are, of course, some, I would say, modest stumbling blocks here. The first one I would mention is the issue of non-self within the Buddhist tradition, which is a very strong tradition, a very strong aspect both of belief and of practice. The extent to which, within a Buddhist tradition, one is not supposed to identify oneself with any part of the phenomenal world. One is not supposed to identify oneself with anything in the world. One is not supposed to grasp towards any of these things. Now, to an extent, this may be the kind of thing that can be taken on board by a Christian or a Jew as saying that the phenomenal world is a world that is different from the world to come, and so therefore we're not supposed to attach ourselves to it. Also, not identifying ourselves with any aspect within our own mind may be different from certain aspects of traditional Christian theology, where we are identified with some aspect of our soul. But these are, I think, in the scheme of things, relatively minor. There's also, as I've discussed in an earlier video, which I can link up here somewhere, the issue of non-prayer within a Buddhist tradition, that one just doesn't, at least in traditional early Buddhism, prayer is seen as being not particularly useful. And so in certain more contemporary Buddhist traditions that are influenced by that early tradition, also prayer is really not part of it. But again, perhaps that's something that we can simply bracket and leave to one side. If prayer is in the tradition that you come from, if you're Christian or Jew or in another religion that involves prayer, there's nothing to say you can't do it. It's simply not part of this practice. Or there are other, shall we say, more traditional religious Buddhist practices that do involve prayer that might be of more use. So as an upshot, can you be a Christian or a Jewish Buddhist or a Buddhist from some other tradition? I think, of course, yes, you can. But I think in that case, what you really are is becoming a kind of a secular Buddhist. That is, you're taking the part of Buddhism that is common in, as it were, the sort of open secular playing field that we all inhabit. The parts that involve this life practice, the parts that involve practice in general, as opposed to belief or doctrine. So to that extent, a secular Buddhist approach, I think, is a more all-encompassing kind of Buddhist approach. It's one that involves people from other traditions, as well as people from the Buddhist tradition. So when I sit down to meditate in a day-long Buddhist retreat, a meditation retreat, and my seatmate is a Christian pastor, my feeling is that we are both together in a kind of a secular approach to this material. Not, of course, to say that the pastor is going to be secular about his or her Christian faith, but there will be secular at least about the Buddhist material, the Buddhist practice, and its kind of this life orientation. So I'd be interested to know if any of you come from other traditions, other religious traditions, or if you even retain them, if you still are Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever it might be, and yet find these Buddhist practices useful. Because I think one can be a very traditional believer in another tradition and yet believe that the kinds of practices that we do in a Buddhist context, in particular a secular Buddhist context, can be very useful, as we've seen with traditional Catholic monastics and practitioners of Zen or Tibetan or Theravada Buddhism. So I hope that's been useful, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Bye-bye. Thanks.